Hi listeners, Jason here. PHSCon 2024 was nothing short of amazing. We had 400 community members come together, both in person and online, to rapidly progress our understanding and practice of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. Over the 2 days, we laughed together, we were inspired, and we learnt. If you missed out, don't worry, on-demand access to content is now available at phscon.com. Plans are already underway for a bigger and better PHSCon back in Sydney for 2025. So save the date for next year when we return to a larger venue on June 19th and 20th. Now, on to this episode.
No one comes into the workplace as a blank slate. Leaders need to be aware that inviting people to bring their whole selves also includes their trauma. We'll talk about the importance of trauma informed leadership up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each week, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk psychological health and safety. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So according to the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, 70% of adults in the United States have experienced a traumatic event at some point in their lives. This is equivalent to 223.4 million people. A traumatic event is defined as an event that threatens a person's physical safety or the safety of another person and leaves the victim feeling intense fear or helplessness. Some examples of a traumatic event include accidents or injuries, physical violence, sexual violence, war-related events, the death of a loved one, serious injury of a child. Conversations and actions to establish psychological safety in organizations have become more common, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. It's increasingly common to hear organizations say that they welcome people to bring their whole selves to work. Well, this also means people's trauma comes with them. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of trauma-informed leadership. And my guest today has some background and experience to share with us in that arena. And we're going to start, as I so often do, with an introduction of my guest by my guest with this question. Who is Manya Chylinski?
Well, David, I am Manya Chylinski, but I'm thinking you want a little bit more in depth. So I am, in no particular order, a trauma survivor. I'm a keynote speaker and consultant. I am a writer. I am an advocate. And I am someone who now, because of my experience with trauma, lives my life working to change the world so that we're paying more attention to trauma and those invisible mental and emotional wounds.
Hmm. Wow. So, this is going to be a very interesting conversation for me, and I'll get into that here in just a second. I have one other question that I ask everyone, the kind of the standard opening too. It's not this one is actually totally standard because everybody gets the same thing. What does psychological health and safety mean to you? When you hear that, what does that mean to you?
It means that I am feeling seen and supported. And a really big one for me is that my experience is validated. Yeah, and that I don't have fear of being judged for sharing my story or being who I am.
Yeah, Yeah, I asked that question of everyone intentionally, not to get the kind of a textbook type answer thing, but to really, because it's not like everybody runs around with a dictionary and tries to figure out what that is. We get a perception about what that is. And so important about, the point that you made about not feeling judged by. So again, people will say, and I said a little bit of in the monologue there, that uh, there's this conversation about psychological safety and people should be free to bring their whole selves. And then when I bring myself, I feel like you didn't really want me to say that part because it's like, say all the things that we want to hear, but don't, yeah, like, we can't talk about that part. And my whole self includes sometimes things that might be a little uncomfortable for everybody, but it's a part of who I am. Um, I spent, and I share this with folks, I spent 32 years riding on fire trucks in different places around the country. And there's a lot out there that people wouldn't necessarily want to talk about, but it's life. I mean, it's things that happen in life. And I understand that you have a story related to experiencing trauma yourself. And can you share whatever portion of that you feel comfortable sharing? Can you share a little bit about your experience of trauma?
Absolutely. Am I'm sure some listeners will find this weird. I was about to say I'm happy to share the story of the worst day of my life because it actually really is important to me to normalize talking about things like this. So, short answer is I'm a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. I was standing in the bleacher seats when the first bomb went off directly across the street from me. I'm grateful that I walked away without physical wounds, but I did have mental and emotional wounds. Um, the longer story is that I developed post traumatic stress and have really struggled. The point that we're recording now, it's been a little over 11 years and have had ups and downs throughout that time. I mean, generally trending to resolve the post traumatic stress. Um, and the journey for me was very much due to the fact that those of us with mental and emotional wounds after the bombing were not the story. We were not the story in the news media. We were largely ignored by the response. And I really struggled with that and feeling isolated and alone and thinking that it was actually my fault that I felt bad because I wasn't seeing my story in the news and, the police chief and the mayor and the governor weren't talking about the mental health side of things in their press conferences. So that must mean there's something wrong with me. So that feeling of isolation and being marginalized in an event that changed my whole life, um, really has defined my life for the past 11 years. The first couple of years, it defined it by me being in the throes of post traumatic stress and struggling to function. And then it turned into me standing on stages and sharing the story in the hopes of making changes and talking to public safety professionals about don't forget the people like me in an event. And don't forget to plan ahead to take care of us. And don't forget that afterwards we have these needs. And then that has evolved into what I do now, which is working with organizations to help them be trauma sensitive, to build environments where there's compassionate leadership and they are, listening to and validating the experiences of their employees.
Mm. Can you think of anything before this that was similarly traumatizing, or was this, at least in your life experience, as big as it's been?
In my life experience, this is as big as it's been. And it's, like I said, it has in some ways been consuming of my life over the last 11 years. Very different now, certainly than 9 years ago. But no, this has been the biggest trauma.
Mm. Yeah, I again, I particularly for those of us who have spent time in the public safety community, there is a lack of awareness that just because I see something multiple times, I probably shouldn't be seeing either. I think what they often do is forget that for the person who experienced it on the other end, the person who's calling 911, the person who even saw it on television, I mean, the people have different kinds of perceptions about what just happened. And we 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 pay a lot of attention to the blood and the gore and the lives lost and the physical kinds of things that we can see because they are they're easier to even describe, but it's harder. Well, the person walked away. What's the problem? At least they didn't. There's that kind of conversation that happens. That so why are they feeling that way? Instead of realizing that none of us have. There's nothing wrong with how I feel. And you also can't tell me, for somebody to tell me, oh, you just don't understand. No, I understand completely how I feel. I may not understand what happened or why I feel this way, but I know how I feel. And I think that's a part of the challenge that other groups of human beings have, whether they be leaders or not, is to your point, is validating how other people feel. You have, first of all, the right to feel however you want to feel about it. And your feeling and mine may be totally different, and it doesn't make either of them wrong, but it is so there's a difference between pain and harm. And it is painful to have my experience not validated by anybody, and the longer it goes on, it becomes hurt. It just does.
Yeah, David, I had people tell me to my face, standing inches away, that my experience didn't count. I had somebody tell me that I had no right to be upset because I still had both of my legs. And these were incredibly difficult things to hear at a time when I was feeling very vulnerable, as I said, as if, well, obviously it's just my fault. And then these people were confirming I didn't have a right to feel that way. And I know now it's very uncomfortable to deal with somebody who's dealing with a trauma, and it's very uncomfortable to be next to them or hold those feelings with them. And I think sometimes it's easier for people to simply deny that it's existing.
Right, right, right. So how how did that experience affect how you interacted with the rest of the world?
Oh gosh, I would say it has very much changed, and not to put a value judgment on it, but I would say improved how I deal with the world. Now, I would tell you, I believe it is true that before this, I was a reasonably compassionate people. I am an empathetic person. I am someone who has always been quite sensitive and feels things very strongly, and understands how other people are feeling about things. After the bombing, and with all the work that I did in mindfulness and meditation and learning how to take care of my own feelings, and recognizing when I was responding to something because of the trauma, not because what was actually happening in front of me in that moment, I started to be able to see that in others. And not that I look at the whole world and all I see is trauma responses, but I can absolutely now understand so much more when someone is upset with me or yelling at me, or behaving in a way that maybe doesn't fit with what's actually in the happening to us in the moment. And I can recognize, well, this is coming from someplace else. And I've also been able to be more present with my family and friends and colleagues and loved ones when they're going through something, much more open to just listening and asking questions rather than trying to fix it, or here's my experience, here's my advice, what you should do. So it's really changed a lot. And there isn't really a way to look back and see how much change is there. I wish there was. I wish I could see because it feels like a lot.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the work of Dr. Ellen Langer. She's a psychology professor at Harvard who suggests that and one of her many suggestions about the world, but that nothing is inherently good or bad. It is basically how we choose to look at it, because even in this act of terrorism, in the people who were, killed and maimed and all of that, as painful physically as it was, as painfully emotionally as it was, even from that, there have been there have been things that have, for people, become better later. That, and it's not to suggest that we have to have places bombed. We didn't need that, but we don't need that kind of stuff going on. But people do come out of these traumatic situations. In some cases, they come out with something that they can use that is uplifting, that is helpful, that helps them live the rest of their life differently than they did before. And it just depends on which one we are able or choose to focus on, you know?
And
Yeah.
people talk about post-traumatic growth. So that you have learned and you've grown from it. And I actually read an article that said, well, is it really, or is that person, did they just evolve naturally? So it is now 11, I am now 11 years older. It would some of this have happened naturally? Maybe. I think as we get older, we tend to perhaps be a little more empathetic to those around us. But I find it interesting to think that, it is something that some people can do to grow after a tragedy. Um, it isn't something that happens to everyone, and we shouldn't expect it of everyone. I'm just, amazed and I guess proud of myself that I took this thing that was just horrific and, came out of it just more alive and more present as a human.
Right. Right. Yeah. I just, even the conversations about these types of things are just really interesting because, on the one hand, there are some who might say, well, as you've heard, that this just would have happened. But I'm there's a part of me that says, I'm not sure, how could I possibly be who I am today without that? I would have been something. That something would have been whatever it was going to be, but that's a part of my life. I mean, I can't. I've lost. 'Cause somebody asked me recently, how many people have I seen that have either died or were dead when I'd lost count. I mean, I've totally lost count. But I would not be who I am today had I not been exposed to that. I can't, I and I don't want to call it better or worse. It just is what it is. It's a part of our lives.
Right. It's just, I mean, we're all just doing, we're, what's the saying? We're playing the cards we're dealt. And so on one hand, I'm just living my life as I see fit after this thing has happened. But I will tell you that a couple years after the bombing, I surprised myself and I said to somebody, it has been a gift. Now, not that I wanted it. I certainly would not have said that. But I can't go back and change it. And I realized it was because of that, I was able to set more boundaries for myself in relationships and knew what I wouldn't accept in a way that I hadn't before. And there were other little things like that that I realized, oh, I learned that because, or I'm doing this behavior because of this, and this is improving my life. And then out came, I sometimes think of it as a gift.
Yeah, I no, I'm with you. Again, it is how we choose to process what we've been exposed to. That again, it's not like it's I didn't. There was nothing that you did other than live your life and happened to be in the place where this occurred. So there was certainly no intent on your part. But it does make me think about so many people who get into their latter years who had things happen to them and they don't take the approach that you've taken, and they find themselves debilitated by that traumatic thing that happened. And again, this is again not a value judgment on them, but for whatever reason it was so impactful and so difficult for them that they live with the intrusive thoughts. It's difficult for them to carry on a conversation, different take care of themselves. There's all these things going on, but there's a part of me that thinks that um, some of that was exacerbating something else that was already there. That's why I asked the question about whether or not this was the thing or was there something else. Because we all, it's like I had a guest on a while back who talked about the fact we're all computers, human computers, and there's only so much on the hard drive. And when you fill that, that hard drive or sky drive, whatever, if you fill that drive with a bunch of trauma, more and more and more and more and more, even if I recover from the latest, how far back can I go to recover? If I'm not constantly recovering, then you end up with people who just basically can't function because there's something that happened that didn't get addressed.
Right. And, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but if you think about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, there are a tremendous percentage of people who live with, four or five of these that are traumas as you're growing up. And that impacts one's ability to deal with trauma as you get older. So as you're talking about compounding traumas, for I was reading at one point that once you've gone through one significant trauma, you still don't know how you're going to react for the next one. But you could, because it's going to be different and you're going to be a different person, and you may react the same way. In my case, I froze. I, I ended up developing post-traumatic stress and had difficulty functioning. That could happen on the next one. It could kind of compound. Or the next one could be that I now am in a different place and it, you know, sort of rolls off my back a little bit more easily and doesn't leave a lasting impact. So even within an individual who has grown from it, we don't know that that means the next one's going to be better.
Right, right. So share with me a little bit about this concept of trauma informed leadership. What's that about?
So, the concept of being trauma informed is something you might have heard of if you're in the healthcare field. We talk about, um, making sure that we're building an environment of safety where there's trust and transparency, where we're not re traumatizing somebody. So, for example, we're not making them tell us about their trauma in order to get support, or we're not somehow behaving in a way that is also traumatizing to them. And, it's about building awareness of trauma. It's got many pieces, but it's building awareness of trauma, providing training so people understand what it means and how it impacts people, and then making sure that the environment and the culture is supportive and validating and paying attention to mental well-being. And there is a formal kind of trauma informed training. Mine is not, the work that I do is not exactly that. And I tend to refer to it as trauma sensitive. So it incorporates a lot of that, um, a lot of the principles of being trauma informed. Again, building that sense of safety, collaboration, empowering individuals, nothing about us without us. So helping organizations be more inclusive and more open when they're you know, dealing with a particular event or just building their culture.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's I don't think I'd heard that description before, the trauma sensitive. Trauma informed. At least there's practitioners and whatnot out there, and I think that's actually a an interesting way to put it for normal folks. I mean, I would say normal folks. For the average person, I might not be totally informed about this thing, but I'm at least sensitive to it enough to know, well, that's a thing. That's a thing. That's a thing that's going to affect the other person. And, by me being in their presence, it's probably going to affect me as well. It's just kind of an awareness type of thing that is actually really important.
I think so. I feel in the conversations I have with individuals, I feel one on one, almost everybody I talk to gets it. They understand how trauma impacts people. Many people have someone in their family who's undergone a trauma if they have not themselves. So I feel individually we most people get it. And then it's when you build it out and you're thinking about an organizational level, like, a municipal government, a workplace, a factory, any place where humans gather, it's harder for it to be this larger principle that people think about, right? We get it one-on-one in our individual relationships. We can't always translate that to society at large.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
What are some thoughts you have about how? Because I believe that cultures get built by people. I mean, we kind of build a culture ourselves, and whatever culture is existent because the humans that were there created it. And so when we're having this conversation around trauma sensitivity, trauma informed, what is it that the traumatized person, if they're able to do this, should be sharing with the leadership or with the organization themselves? Because it kind of does. So if I have to be able to get in touch with my own situation, what's going on with me, what are some suggestions and thoughts you have about how that should be shared with the organization or with the leadership?
Absolutely. Well, and you said a key phrase there, if they're able to, because not every trauma survivor wants to or is able to disclose their situation, or really express their needs. It could be, fear of judgment, in a professional environment, maybe fear of not seeming like a professional. But it's really important, if you are a trauma survivor and you're wanting to make a change, to take care of yourself first. Focus on that self care and make sure that you're setting up boundaries and you're taking advantage of any of the programs that your organization does have to offer, like employee assistance programs or mental health support. And then start small. Maybe have a conversation with your supervisor or a trusted colleague about your trauma or what would make you feel safe or supported. Maybe share resources anonymously, or if there's an intranet you can kind of direct people to, but start small. And I started by writing letters, not in a workplace, but I started reaching out by writing some letters to people in power and saying we need help. I didn't start by standing on the TEDx stage. Like, that took me a while to get there. So, I think if you are able to, there are opportunities to educate and, just start small, and ideally, we are not relying only on those individuals to share their story. Um, you know, we're building a culture that is supportive, and And maybe, you know, the traumatized person needs to provide some input, but hopefully then it'll multiply and sort of snowball from there. Um, you know, I know you've heard this phrase, we don't rise to the level of our ideals or our goals. We fall to the level of our training. So when we're tested, we can't access some of these things that we're dreaming about. We just go to what we know. And so to me, that's why it's so important to be building environments that are trauma sensitive and supportive so that even when pressed, we're falling back to something that is still a supportive environment. Um, self advocacy is important, but I want to see it that we're not just relying on the traumatized individual. And I'm a little bit kind of presenting myself as I am the traumatized individual who can now come in and talk to you and tell you what it's like. So you don't have to force somebody in your organization to reveal that they've been traumatized in order to get help.
So, just as we start to wrap this up, I have a couple of more questions. One is, um, there's a lot of work out there, a lot of opportunities, a lot of programs around resiliency for the human being, mindfulness and resiliency and trauma informed care, and there's all these things to try to help the human being after they've been traumatized. So, talk a little bit about some things. We don't have a lot of time, but talk a little bit about some of the things that organizations can do that are actually pretty simple to to create an environment where they won't be traumatized while they're at work, or to be supportive or sensitive while they're at work.
Well, one of them, as you know, is building an organization that has psychological safety and, as free as possible from psychosocial hazards. It is an environment where leadership is open and will allow themselves to be vulnerable. Um, that is something that builds trust, and trust is something very important in building a trauma sensitive environment. Um, I think having having all the standard benefits of mental health support and EAPs, all of those are important, but it's also important to be building that culture. And the way to do that is to have leaders who have compassion, leaders who, building flexibility into the workplace. We know that's a big thing post pandemic. And the other one is completely escaping me for some reason. Um, I guess, making sure that you're prioritizing employee well-being and that people know that. And they know, and we talked about they feel safe sharing their story. Maybe not with everybody, but maybe with a trusted colleague or with a supervisor. So, did that answer the question?
That absolutely does. But again, there's only so much that can be shared in a short period of time, because these are complex kinds of issues. They are, but some of the solutions are not all that complex.
They're not. And the culture that you have in an organization, you either decided what it was going to be or it just happened because nobody wanted to do anything about it. But it's a result of decisions that are made. So that means we can make different decisions. We can make decisions to be thinking about mental well-being as well as physical well-being. We can make decisions to be trauma sensitive or trauma informed. So it isn't hard, and it doesn't have to be this complete overhaul of your whole benefit system or your whole program. You can take tiny incremental steps to building compassion, being more vulnerable, um, having empathy when something's going on in the workplace. It's tiny steps that make a real big change.
Yes, 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 and yeah, and sometimes the lack of steps that can create really big problems, because doing nothing is not nothing.
Right. It is a choice. It's a
It's a
choice.
choice. Yeah, yeah. It's doing nothing is not nothing. There's an impact when you do nothing. It just is. So that's a part of the job that you take on when you say, particularly you say you want to be in leadership. That's part of the job. Part of the job that's required. So as we start to wrap the conversation, we had an interesting opportunity to join you on your podcast. And so you're a podcaster, speaker, consultant, all that. So if uh, if folks want to follow you, kind of know more about the work that you do, organization out there who's looking for someone that has a story similar to yours, they don't want to, they want to address this and they don't want to go and re-traumatize the folks inside the organization. Um, Tell us a little bit about how people can follow your work and get in contact with you.
Yes, thank you, David. The best place to get me is on my website, which is manyachilinski.com. And there you can find, information about my speaking and the work that I do. You can find a link to the podcast. I am also, my social media presence is on LinkedIn. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. Also, Manya Chylinski. Happy to connect with people, happy to talk about this topic. It is my guiding question is how can we support trauma survivors, to be seen, heard, and validated in our organizations and in our communities. So if that's a topic that's interesting to you, I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Wow, that's again, we had this same conversation, well, the same challenge when I was a guest of yours. This could go on for a while because um, it's such a weighty kind of conversation, but such a common one as well. That you are not the only person who has been traumatized. You and But you have a unique point of view because it was your view, and there are those who could really benefit from hearing your view. Theirs might be a little tough for them at the time, but hearing from someone else who has now a few years behind you in terms of how you felt and's been able to overcome. Sometimes that's what people need, is just a model that says, I can do it. She did it. And she may be able to help me, or just, but I'm hopeful that just people hearing parts of your story that will help them. And if they need additional help, you've provided some opportunity to be able to help them even more. Yeah. Yes. Thanks very much for taking some time to chat with me. I really I find myself being blessed by the gift of people's time, the opportunity to sit down and talk about these things, and and it's also, and I think this is a question that you asked me when we talked on your show. This is what gives me hope, that there are folks that that have made it, that have come through. Of all of the people who, you're the first person that I've actually talked to, even though, strangely enough, I was actually working in the area, and it wasn't really close, but I was working in Massachusetts at the time, was really far away, middle of the state. But so it's interesting how these roads even will connect later on, that, who thought I'd have the opportunity to chat with someone who's actually there. So yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for sharing your story with us on this episode. So, if you're watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something that you've heard will bring you back next time. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. Please watch, like, and subscribe, and share the podcast. You can find it on the Flourish DX YouTube page, and plan to come back and see us again. We love to have you. We enjoy having these conversations, and we'll look forward to the next one. So please join the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting to us on LinkedIn. Become a subscriber there. We're looking forward to making a difference, and we're going to need you to do it. So until next time, stay tuned. Look out for the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Tune in each week for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.